This is my first time in Finland, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. So I hope you enjoy hearing about Australia as well. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors who come from my own university, Murdoch, and from Griffith University. And also this paper is a partnership with the equivalent to Meta Halitus in Western Australia, with the Department of Environment and Conservation. So today I'm going to introduce sustainability with respect to wildlife tourism, and then talk about managing wildlife tourism for sustainability, to talk about development of a framework for assessing sustainability, and then lastly talking a little bit about environmental ethics. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with this diagram with the circles on it, but I wanted to remind all of us that sustainability is about environmental sustainability, so looking after the beautiful environment that surrounds us. It's also about social sustainability, so the sustainability of your businesses, of communities, and of the experiences that visitors have, and also about the economy, which is again about the economic benefits of your particular business. And wildlife tourism, to be sustainable, needs to sit at this junction of those three circles. And this is a question I raise for you, is this sustainable? This is stingray tourism, many people dominating the animals, in fact more people than there are animals. As part of my introduction, I wanted to talk about who actually owns the wildlife, because this has important implications for their management. They are very mobile species. Bears move across boundaries. We heard this morning how wolves move across the boundary between Russia and Finland. So it's very difficult to manage wildlife when they move across these boundaries. So no one actually owns the wildlife. They're very mobile. They occur on all sorts of different lands. They occur on public lands, on national parks. They occur on private lands, and they also occur on commons, and they can move across all of these lands. So in terms of managing an industry, managing a product, it's very difficult to manage wildlife because they're so mobile and they're found on so many different types of lands. And they've been described as a common pool resource issue, and that's this little box down here in the bottom corner. And it's because it's really difficult to exclude other people. If you're a tour operator and you've put lots of money, invested lots of money into a wildlife tourism business, it's very hard to exclude other wildlife tourism operators who might come in and have a free ride. So it's actually quite difficult to exclude other industry, other groups who may not be investing. Also, there's resource subtractability. Many of you have been, I'm sure, have been bird watching, and another bird watcher has come in and scared the bird away. So there's the issue of subtractability. One tourist may actually detract from the experience of other ones. These combine to give this investment incentive problem, so it can be quite problematic for tour operators to invest in the industry because it's difficult to exclude other operators who aren't investing, and it makes it very hard to invest. And that can lead to non-sustainability and the tragedy of the commons. So what I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about today is how we can overcome this tragedy of the commons so there is an incentive to invest in wildlife tourism. I'm going to give a fantastic case study. It's marine, but don't be put off. The principles and the ideas that I'll be talking about are just as relevant to terrestrial species. All right, this is where we do our technology thing. So I'd like to spend 5 minutes introducing you to whale sharks in Western Australia, and then we'll return again to the PowerPoint presentation.
Hi, I'm David Ireland, the Wildlife Man. I want you to join me at beautiful Ningaloo Reef in Western Australia. We're going to swim with ocean giants, and I promise you, the experience will be amazing. The Ningaloo coastline has been included on the World heritage list for its natural beauty and biological diversity. Ningaloo Reef is shadowed by the magnificent Cape Range that can only be described as breathtaking. The ancient limestone escarpments rise to over 300 metres above sea level and shelter Ningaloo from the easterly winds. Ningaloo is the world's largest fringing reef. It stretches over 260 kilometres, encompassing a massive 5,000 square kilometres of ocean. As we dive Ningaloo, we swim over hundreds of species of coral. And huge schools of pelagic fish. Ningaloo is home to over 500 species of fish. The gutters and caves shelter huge clouds of bait fish that in turn support a thriving marine environment. Migrate to Ningaloo in far larger numbers than the east coast of Australia. Magnificent mantas also thrive in the unpolluted Ningaloo waters. It's now time to swim with the ocean giants aboard the Ningaloo Whaleshark and dive boat. We venture out behind the reef. We swap our scuba gear for mask and snorkel. And in no time, a monster appears from the depths, a whale shark. Ningaloo is one of the only few places in the world where people can swim with the world's largest fish. Whale sharks can grow to a staggering 16 metres or more in length and weigh well over 20 tonnes. These gentle giants use their enormous mouth to take in a variety of food. Tiny plankton, bait fish, sardines and even small squid all get trapped in the gill rakers. Whale sharks are filter feeders and harmless to humans. Swimming with the whale sharks of Ningaloo is one of my most rewarding and exciting experiences. To learn more about Western Australia, go to Western Australia.
So that introduces you to the case study that I wanted to talk about. And the whale shark is the world's largest, yet most poorly known fish. It's regarded as vulnerable. It's listed on the IUCN Red List as vulnerable. It's very docile. I could hear a few people laughing. It's not going to eat people that are swimming with it, so it's docile. And the threats are fishing. It's still eaten off the coast of a number of countries in Southeast Asia, and it also suffers through collisions with boats, with large vessels, and tourism may or may not be a threat to it. It's not known as yet. We've seen where it occurs, where this particular tourism enterprise takes place. The photograph there of Australia, or the image there of Australia. To explain a little bit about how whale shark tourism occurs is important, because I'm going to then go on and talk about how it's managed. The way that it works is that it's a day tour. People start on the land, they go out in a boat, like that boat up there in that top corner. A spotter plane goes out at the same time and spots for whale sharks, and when the spotter plane spots a whale shark, it radios to a number of boats, so it services a number of boats, anywhere between 10 or 15 boats, and the boats then race to where the whale shark is, and then the tourists are dropped in the water. It's very deep, you can't see the bottom. They're dropped in the water in front of the whale shark, and then the whale shark swims through the people, and people can swim alongside it. And you can get an experience anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes as the whale shark slowly moves through the water. So you can see there's potentially a number of issues. I'm sure all of you who are involved in wildlife tourism are concerned about safety. So there's clearly safety issues, and there's clearly issues in terms of the species and the welfare of whale sharks. Tours have operated since 1987, so it's quite a new industry. There are now between 8,000 and 10,000 visitors annually, over half of them international visitors, so it's a big group of visitors. It was calculated that in 2006 that visitors spent about US $6 million in the local region. What I want to talk about now, and you're probably wondering why there is a picture of a donkey. No? There's a picture of a donkey there because I want to talk about regulation as the stick, and I want to talk about self-regulation, which is the carrot. And everyone who is in tourism always wonders whether they would prefer the stick or whether they would prefer the carrot. So I'll talk about both the stick and the carrot with respect to the whale shark. So firstly, let's look at the stick, at regulation. And the whale shark is managed according to several pieces of legislation. There's a state government act which enables the government to manage marine parks and national parks. So there is a level of protection established that enables management by the government of those areas, and the whale shark occurs largely within a marine park. So there is a designation of the water that enables government control. There is also provision within that legislation for licensing of tour operators. So anyone who is operating a tourism enterprise in a national park or marine park requires a licence. So there are those two abilities in this case to manage whale shark tourism. One, it's in a marine park, and two, there is a licensing requirement. And lastly, the species is protected by national and state legislation. So there are a number of levels of regulatory protection. I'll mention the licences here. The licences are restricted to 15. So across the whole of that large area, there are only 15 licences, and it's a competitive process for people to get a licence. And there are sustainability criteria that potential operators have to meet to get a licence. The licences are operational for 1 to 5 years, and if the operators perform well against the sustainability criteria, then they have the option of renewal, which you want because you invest a lot of money in a boat. There's a levy on tourists, $25 per adult and $12.50 per child. That goes straight into paying for research. So there's a whale shark fund that is used for management and research. And operators are required to have a GPS tracker on their boat so that the government knows where they're going, and they're required to say how many people they are taking on each trip. So there's very good information on where the industry is operating. So that's the big stick, or perhaps small stick, big stick. Now I'm talking about the carrot, about the self-regulation. And there is a code of practice which aims to reduce negative effects of interactions. So the tourists affecting the behaviour of the whale sharks. It has been developed by the West Australian Government with the operators, and that's why I'm calling it self-regulation, because the operators sat down with the government and worked out these guidelines between them. So it hasn't been imposed. It hasn't been the operators carrying on their own. It's been a process of negotiation over about 10 or 15 years to work out this code of conduct. And that code of conduct applies both to the tourists and to the operators. So what does the code of conduct do? First of all, it says that people are not to go within closer than 4 metres to the whale shark, around its side and its back. They're not to get dropped closer than 3 metres or to swim closer than 3 metres to the front. When I did this trip, I was swimming with a very large, extremely large German man, and he struggled to get out of the way of the whale shark, and it was hard to decide who was more slow moving, the large German man or the whale shark. But generally, the operators try and keep people 3 metres away from the whale shark. There's photography is permitted, but no flash photography, no artificial propulsion, and no touching of the whale shark. That's what all those signs show. People are to be dropped, tourists are to be dropped no closer than 30 metres to the front of the animal to enable it to swim freely. And the way that the boats work is that the first boat that gets to the whale shark has up to 60 minutes in contact with the whale shark, and it then has to move on and let another boat move into contact with the whale shark. However, the operators have worked out, and the other boats have to stand away. They have to stand 300 metres away. But the operators have compromised, and what they do is they each have about 15 minutes on the whale shark, and then they let another operator come in. So one boat will come in, drop the swimmers, then pick them up, and then another boat will come in. So there's only ever one operator in contact, and they're not violating the conditions. So that's one way of managing the industry. What I wanted to talk about next, again with sustainability as the focus, is how can you assess whether a potential product is going to be sustainable in terms of the little diagram I had with the 3 parts to it. And it's really important to be able to assess the sustainability of a potential industry, and also to assess if existing tourism products are sustainable or not. And that's important because wildlife tourism can impact on animals and the environment, so it's really important to know and understand that, and then being able to manage accordingly. Negative impacts in particular can be very difficult to identify and then very difficult to manage. And so potential impacts on biophysical and social conditions need to be assessed, so really important for sustainability. So this is the underlying premise for an assessment framework. It's to protect wildlife from impacts, so to make sure that in the long run that particular wildlife tourism opportunity is sustainable. So it's looking at the long term, how can we keep things sustainable for the long term. It's important to protect the environment from impacts, so that's the habitat that a species might live in. And the other really important part, and I must admit, I travel the world preaching this, it's really important to focus on visitor satisfaction, and I didn't hear much conversation this morning about visitor satisfaction, but it's something that I'm obsessive about because it's integral to the product. It's really important to not only maintain visitor satisfaction but to increase it, because that keeps the industry viable and builds support for wildlife and for conservation. So if we have these 3 things, then we get a sustainable, successful wildlife tourism experience. And Lassie, I have to say last night it was about an experience. It wasn't just viewing bears, it was the whole package of experience that matters. So that's what's really important, it's having this experience. That's fundamental. So framework elements, here I'm focused on the ecological and environmental, and then the operational and visitor assessment. And if you've got those, then it's the basis for an assessment framework. What I'm going to show you next is a couple of examples of where David and I and another colleague have applied this to Whaleshark tourism. This could be applied to any particular wildlife tourism enterprise. It's not just applicable to whale sharks. And one of the things I really like about this particular assessment framework is it has a fundamental interest in research. And I've been really impressed so far in Finland in that you know the number of species, number of animals you've got in particular populations. That's really impressive. As an aside, I did a review a number of years ago for WWF about threatened species, and one of the biggest problems in terms of managing threatened species is not knowing the numbers of those particular species. And you know your numbers, and that's really valuable. So this assessment framework has a focus, very strong focus on understanding the biology and the ecology of the species. So what is its status? At the top we've got it's vulnerable. Is it a lone or solitary species? Is it in a group? What age is it? And interestingly, the whale sharks at Ningaloo are all adolescents. They're all young males. So every year we have 300 to 500 young males coming through Ningaloo. Known behaviour, we know that it's migratory. So that then creates issues in it moving across boundaries, potentially being fished in other countries. So again, it's giving us more information about sustainability in a global sense. Population is unknown. We don't at the moment know what the population numbers are of whale sharks. We know very little about its reproduction. We don't know how many animals there are, and we know a little bit about feeding behaviour. So this assessment framework can give us a very quick look at, number one, what we know and don't know, and it's often really important to know what we know, and then secondly, a summary of the biology of the species. So this is more here on the ecological and environmental assessment. The habitat, are there negative impacts? We now know that the whale sharks have a tendency to dive and to stop feeding near the surface when they have too many contacts with visitors. So we know that there are some potentially adverse consequences from whale shark tourism. We know there is some avoidance behaviour, we know there's temporary disturbance. Are there any anthropogenic activities other than tourism placing pressure on them? Again, we don't know. And we do know there is long-term monitoring taking place as part of the industry. So again, quite a nice checklist, and while you're looking at this, you can be thinking about the species that you're interested in and how this checklist might work for that particular species, whether it's a large carnivore or whether it's a bird, and the usefulness of this checklist for that. Two slides now on the operational side of things. Really nice summary here of the operational environment. So it involves swimming, it involves a plane, and it involves a motorised boat. When you look at that first point, it makes you realise why tour operators would want a licence that extends 5 years and beyond. Because you think about the capital investment, so lots of money invested in boats and in the plane, and so it's very useful seeing the type of activity because it indicates how much is invested, and that has an influence on the length of licence, because operators are not going to invest unless they can see some ongoing return. Reliability of wildlife viewing, very reliable. Accessibility, it's offshore, so it's going to require tourists who are very committed. A licence is required by the operator, it's seasonal. Number of tours, there's up to 14 up to 15 each day, 7 days a week, and it operates in April through to July. So it sounds quite similar to Finnish wildlife tourism in that it's highly seasonal. So there are all of the issues that go with seasonality. Interactions between operators overlap, yes. And nice example with the Whalesharks of how operators have cooperated to build the code of conduct and to work together. Although I have to say, when the spotter plane comes down with a message to the boats that they've seen a whale shark, the boat with the biggest motor wins. So in bird watching, the man with the biggest camera lens wins. Well, in whale shark tourism, the man with the biggest motorboat wins, and they get to the whale shark first. So it's quite competitive to get to the whale sharks first. Then there are guidelines and a code of conduct. So last operational one. So we'll look at number 13, tourist interactions are monitored. There's a knowledge of visitor demographics, so there is routine visitor surveys to find out where people come from and are they satisfied with the experience. So there's good information going back into management of the industry based on satisfaction. Interpretation is offered, and this is what's covered in interpretation. Unknown whether safety issues are covered, which is a concern, a great concern. There are behavioural guidelines provided, and then unknown against all of those boxes over there. That's a very clear signal for managers and for the tourism industry that interpretation needs some work. So immediately, right up front, it's very clear that interpretation is a problem with this, in this particular situation. So what would be the potential benefits for you and for us in applying this assessment framework? It informs policy and management. Straight up, it's apparent that interpretation needs more work, just through running through this quick assessment process. It assesses the potential for wildlife tourism operations by suggesting where information is needed, more research is needed. Would a particular enterprise be viable or not? It can help in designing, assessing and approving licences, so putting conditions onto licences about what might be sustainable or not. And it can contribute to developing standards for certification. We've got a certification scheme in Australia run by Ecotourism Australia, and many of our tour operators are certified within that system as being sustainable. And you've got a number of systems within Europe that a number of people, I'm sure, are certified within those particular systems. Now, this assessment framework isn't perfect. Hopefully some people have noticed that. The post-lunch drowsiness hasn't set you off. You've noticed the gaps in our assessment framework. 2 gaps at the bottom. Very important in terms of sustainability to understand resident communities and are they benefiting from wildlife tourism. For tourism to be truly sustainable, it needs to benefit local people and local communities. And it also needs to be economically sensible. So it's really important in terms of sustainability that these enterprises are economically sustainable as well. So, is the Whaleshark tourism industry sustainable? We published a paper in 2010 saying that we thought it probably was. We thought that the legislative and non-regulatory environment was ensuring sustainability. So our sense was that that combination of the carrot and the stick and the carrot was contributing to the industry being sustainable. However, the status of the shark population is unknown, so we're not entirely sure that it is sustainable because we don't know what's happening in Southeast Asia or off the coast of Africa. So we don't really know, and that comes down to whale sharks being a common pool resource issue. Their ability to move across boundaries, to be mobile, makes it very, very difficult to manage them for sustainability. So we really need a global approach to whale sharks. The last part, and both Tita and Nisa said to me, this part is so complicated, we don't want to translate this. So I've spent a long time trying to make it less complicated. So we'll see how we go. You can buy me a beer at the end if it's not too complicated. So what it's about is talking about applying an environmental ethic and the way that we manage wildlife, particularly large carnivores, and I'll use an example from Australia in a moment. We have a very anthropocentric view, which is that humans rule, I'm being very dramatic here, but humans rule the earth and all other organisms are on the earth to service human needs. Very anthropocentric view that puts humanity at the centre. Versus an eco-centric view at the other end of the spectrum, which says that all organisms are equal and we're interconnected. And so what I'll be suggesting with the example that follows is that we move our thinking from an anthropocentric perspective to an ecocentric perspective, and I'll use an Australian example. So I'm going to talk about dingoes. Dingoes are our largest largest terrestrial predator, and they're Australian native wild dogs. And that's not a very attractive looking dog there, but they are quite an attractive looking dog. And the case study I'm going to use is on an island off the east coast of Australia called Fraser Island. And this whole story started on the 30th of April 2001 when 9-year-old Clinton Gage was attacked and killed by two dingoes on Fraser Island. So a child was killed, and it led to this whole series of events. And just fortuitously, when I was sitting at 1 a.m. in the morning working on this presentation a couple of weeks ago, and I was nodding, in the Courier Mail it popped up on my Google News service, and I thought this is divine intervention. On Fraser Island, a disoriented and sleeping tourist was attacked by a dingo pack, and rangers believe at least 2 or more dingoes bit the man, 23, as he lay on a track after stumbling away from a tour group about 2 a.m. on Saturday morning. Apparently he was so drunk that he couldn't move, but he got attacked by dingoes. And so it reignited this whole debate about dingoes. It surprises me they didn't kill him, especially as he's lying down, meaning they probably had access to his throat. So very dramatic. Patrols will be increased. So these are dogs. I mean, it looks like your family dog. Well, may not look like your family dog, but this is what dingoes look like. And this is on Fraser Island. So they are really interacting with people. They're actually highly domesticated with Aboriginal people in Australia, so they have a very long history of interaction with Aboriginal people. So this is Fraser Island. There's Australia, Queensland and Fraser Island's in that little red rectangle. And after 2001, the state government department responsible for Fraser Island, which is a national park, brought out the Fraser Island Dingo Management Strategy. And this management strategy is very anthropocentric. So what it does is it wants to decrease the opportunities for interactions between dingoes and people. So what they've done on Fraser Island is that they have fenced all the campgrounds and all the picnic areas so that the dingoes are kept away from people. So they are physically separating, isolating people from dingoes. They had a major culling program, so they shot dingoes after 2001. And they also are maintaining that culling program. The other thing they are continuing to do is a thing called hazing, where they shoot dingoes with rubber bullets to discourage them from coming near humans. So they're using some very human-centric approaches to managing dingoes. So I'd like to, and this is work I've been doing with a colleague with Leah Burns at Griffith University. What we're suggesting is let's move from an approach which sees humans and nature as separate and humans as dominant to an approach which sees an interconnection between humans and animals, and that we're all part of one ecosystem or a number of interlinked ecosystems. And we've called these our eco-centric principles, and there are 7 of them. And the first of them is to say that wildlife have a value for their own right. They're not just valuable because we can eat them, see them, or photograph them. They have a right, they have an interest, they have a value on their own, just for being there. So a very important first step. The second one we've called moral obligations, and that's saying that the visitors really need to be aware of and informed of the consequences of their actions. If they're going to feed dingoes, which is what they do, then there are going to be consequences that the dingoes will become habituated and they can then have problems in managing them. So it's important that people understand that if they feed dingoes, they may end up getting shot. So that's our second principle. Our third principle we've called moral reasoning. And that's about providing information for visitors so they can understand the effects of their actions. So it's really quite similar to the previous one. The fourth one's a bit more controversial. When my colleague has presented this at conferences with the departmental staff, they've got a bit upset. And we're saying that we're going to apply the precautionary principle. If managers are going to shoot dingoes, then they need to continue to provide justification of why they should be doing that. So it shouldn't just be a fallback, they shouldn't just do it because they've been doing it for a long time. They need to justify and explain clearly why they're doing it. The fifth one is Avatar. Has anyone seen the movie Avatar? Yep? Okay. People? You don't want to admit to it? The Avatar principle is that acknowledging that all organisms are interlinked. For those of you who've seen the movie or not seen it, at the end they have the tree of life and it connects all the organisms on this particular planet. It's saying basically that all organisms are interconnected. So we've called that the Avatar principle. The sixth point is that visitors belong in nature and nature can be aggressive. So 2 very important messages. Firstly, that wildlife belong in nature. They're not something that is not there and is not relevant, and that it can be aggressive. And then lastly, that to encourage managers to reflect on their position, that they may have anthropocentric views and that may be making them think in a particular way. So really to encourage managers to think about their own ethical position and what management that might result in. So to conclude, today has really been about the science of sustainability, what we need to be thinking about, what's being done elsewhere in terms of sustainability, and particularly understanding wildlife tourism as a common pool resource issue. We've all got challenges because of the way that these animals move. If they just sat still, they'd be a lot easier to manage, but they move. And they move across all sorts of interesting boundaries, even between countries, as you know, with your wolf. So that does make managing them problematic. And it means that we need incentives for the industry to invest, often by creating property rights. And one way of doing that is through this regulatory and non-regulatory management approaches. So the stick of legislation, licensing, combined with non-regulatory approaches like codes of conduct. So together they can help address these issues of wildlife as a common pool resource. That's a beaver, by the way. I thought we were going beaver watching last night, so I put beavers up there because when they build a dam, they don't care what property it's on, do they? It doesn't bother them. So you have to manage them irrespective of where they are and what they're doing. So that's the beavers there to remind us of that. There is a framework, an assessment framework which we've developed, which can be used to check and manage for sustainability. and that's sustainability not only of existing enterprises, but of new ones, of potential ones. So it provides a lens, a way of assessing potential wildlife tourism as well. And then lastly, ensuring that ethics matters, and to really reflect on, do we want to manage wildlife in an anthropocentric way, where humans are up here and animals are down here being exploited for our use only, or do we want to take more of an eco-centric approach where the interconnections are far more important? Thank you.
Ja kysymyksiä sinulle. Muuten jos haluat kysyä kysymyksiä suomeksi ja mun kääntämään niitä, niin sopii myös.
Okay, about your first photo, just a question, do people need to have access to go anywhere they want? Because this picture was really strange. I didn't seem to get over it in the whole presentation.
Which picture was it?
The swimmer hugging the fish.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a good example? Is that what we want to tell people? Everything is possible. You can come and you pay us money, you can have the ocean fish.
Absolutely not. No, you've got two approaches there. You can either use I'm separating them as a dichotomy. You can either use codes of conduct, which, for example, in the case of the Antarctic, are voluntary. So the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators there have a voluntary code of conduct which sets how far or how close you can get to animals and how close, how far away you need to be. That's voluntary, and that's to do with the sovereignty of Antarctic. In the example I gave there, the code of conduct which guides the level of interaction is actually based in regulation, so it's actually based within the licensing provisions, but it has been negotiated. So no, you don't want people handling necessarily. And this photo here, that's taken in Bali, and I was appalled in Bali. You can pick up, touch and feed everything, and I don't think that's necessarily appropriate, no. So perhaps that wasn't a good photo to put in.
Provocative, for sure.
I think it was difficult because it got you stuck at the beginning.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pavaka once more. You mentioned that there is a share of the participation fees going for conservation research. What is it in share? Is it 1%, 10% of million?
Well,
it
costs about $400 to swim with the Whaleshark. So if it's $25, what's that?
About 5%, 4%.
About 5%. Yeah. And from what I can see, it goes, a reasonable amount of that goes to research, which I always think is a good thing, being a researcher. I guess there is an argument for increasing the percentage that you take, but that's always a negotiation you have to have with the tourism industry.
Yeah, that would have been my following question, whether it is voluntary by the tourism industry or is it governmental force?
That's a good question. They have a very interesting relationship up there where they negotiate the outcomes. When you look over time, that fee has been increasing. So they've been putting it up periodically over time.
The industry voluntarily increases this amount?
I don't know whether they voluntarily agree, but they agree.
Okay.
I'll just add to that, there's a danger that the operator will lose their license if they don't.
Okay.
There is a danger of that.
Yeah.
So they want to pave the way to make sure that they get the
they can
license.
keep on doing it.
What I didn't mention is if people do touch the whale sharks or contravene any of those codes of conduct, the operators can lose their license. And if visitors contravene that code of conduct, it's a $10,000 fine. So it's quite punitive in terms of if that code of conduct isn't followed.
That relates to question 11 and 12 in your list, where you didn't actually have any ticks on the box to who controls conducting of the tourist and who controls the operator.
Yeah.
So I was looking at that and thinking, well, there's no regulatory force, or is there?
In the paper that we did subsequently after this one, we identified that the Department of Environment and Conservation is out there in a regulatory role. So they have staff based in both the two towns, so
they
you know,
have
Western
eyes
Australia,
and
they
ears
have,
around.
yeah, and they're interestingly enough, because it is a competitive industry, the operators keep an eye on each other.
Yeah.
And when I went out, the operator I was with was watching the other operators with his binoculars. So they're keeping an eye on each other.
Right. Big brother. We have time for one more question. Vi har ytterligare liksom. Hej, okej.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.